My name's Megan Dettenmeyer. I'm the Forestry Extension Educator here at Utah State University. One of the parts of my jobs is finding exciting, interesting speakers to give our Learn at Lunch webinar series. And it was an obvious choice for the first webinar of the year. So I'm really excited that Gavin agreed and had time to present for us today. I'd also like to ask, we have almost 100 people viewing this webinar, so if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself and just letting us know where you're tuning in from, that really helps. And then I have another favor. At the end of the webinar, I have a link to a survey which will help us evaluate this webinar series. So if you wouldn't mind just peeking for that in the chat pod, I'll put the links for that in there. So that just helps me do my job better. So without further ado, Gavin Jones is starting his second year of his PhD this year. He did his master's in Zach Peary's lab as well. He mentioned before the webinar today that the data he's working on has been collected and started being collected before he was even born. So that just really speaks to the importance of this data, the longevity of this data. And I'm excited to learn what he's working on and what he's finding. Nobody probably knows this, but in 2012 I received my master's degree in wildlife biology. So I'm actually a wildlife biologist by trade. I transferred this interest to forestry, and I'm super excited to hear what Gavin has to say about the conservation of the spotted owl and how it relates to the occurrences of megafires in the Sierra Nevada. So anyways, thanks Gavin. I'm looking forward to listening to your talk, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Megan. I just want to make sure that I'm sharing my screen.
Yes. Oh,
all right.
Yes.
Okay. You may have just gotten a sneak peek of my daughter.
Oh my gosh, what a cutie.
Thank you. So, just double checking that everybody can hear me okay. So as Megan mentioned, my name's Gavin, and I'm a PhD student in Professor Zach Peary's lab here at UW-Madison. If you want to check out the types of things that we do in the Peary lab, you can just Google it. Google, Zach Peary UW, and you'll come up with a website. A really neat array of projects in the lab, so I encourage you to check that out. I'm going to try to get rid of this little video here in the corner for a moment. Okay. All right, so first, I want to say thanks to Megan for contacting me to give this webinar. It's pretty exciting to be able to share some of my research. It's a real honor to have all of you joining the call as well. Looks like we have over 100 people online right now. Not very often do grad students get to share their research with such a broad audience in this format. So I'm pretty excited to be able to do that. I will say I hope I'm not too long-winded and rambly during this talk. I want to leave a little bit of time at the end for some questions, because I'm sure there will be some. But in the case that you are interested in a particular question or just want to contact me and follow up, you can email me. My email's at the bottom of this screen here. All right, so with that being said, today I'm pretty excited to share with you some snippets from what will eventually be my PhD dissertation. These are just different sections that have already been completed or that are in progress right now, or that kind of lay on the horizon. So I just want to give you guys an idea about what I'm learning through my work with spotted owls in the Sierra Nevada. And I think we can all agree, at least those of us who are familiar with the Sierra Nevada and management of forests in the Sierra Nevada at this present time. It's a very complicated and divisive and sometimes contentious issue about how do we restore our Sierra Nevada forests, or what are some of the impacts that forest restoration may have on the ecosystem and on species that live in it and depend upon it. And I certainly don't presume to answer all of the questions related to this broader issue of forest restoration. But I certainly hope that some of the things that I'll be presenting on today and that I'll be working on in my dissertation will bring to light at least the answers to some of the questions that we have that linger about the role of forest restoration, in particular its effect on old forest species conservation. In particular, the spotted owl is what I'll be working on and presenting on today, but I think the spotted owl can really act as a model species for other old forest organisms. Certainly because we have the best data, long-term, really high quality, good data on spotted owls. And like Megan said, I'm new to the game in the sense that this project has been ongoing longer than I've even been alive. So it's an incredible project, an incredible source of data, and I'm really excited to be a part of it. So let me jump in now. The Sierra Nevada is one of the most incredible landscapes in the United States and the world. We have this really broad latitudinal range that the Sierra Nevada spans, a really wide elevational gradient, really diverse landforms, giant sequoia, incredible geomorphology in the Sierras, like in Yosemite and some of the other regions of the mountain range. And we also have a very rich biodiversity in the region, an incredible species diversity, both endemic and species that range more broadly. And one of the reasons why this landscape is so diverse is because of the dynamic disturbance regime of fire that's really maintained this diversity in life form over the course of several millennia. The Sierra Nevada, however, like many other landscapes, has a lingering influence of human impact and land use. And us humans have most certainly left our mark in certain ways. In particular, we've left legacies of fire suppression over the past century. So since 1900, we've really seen accelerated change in the Sierra Nevada, particular with fire suppression and fuel buildup, which has changed a lot of the structure of some of these forests. The selective removal of very large old trees, particularly earlier in the logging era, widespread cattle grazing and other agricultural practices, as well as the decoupling of this climate-fire relationship that really brought about a lot of the diversity we see in the region. And what I'm showing you here is a really cool figure from a recent paper by Taylor et al. That came out in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, really showing that the correlation between climate and fire activity decayed beginning in the 1800s, and really around 1900 it completely dropped away. So this is showing that humans have exerted a really strong influence on the fire regime, the disturbance regimes of the Sierra Nevada. One of the consequences of all these changes, of course, is changes in forest structure and process. And that's most obvious when we look at some of these aerial photos from historical times, like this one here from the 1940s. This photo was taken in the Plumas National Forest. And the idea is that historically we had forests that were less dense, at least had a lower density of these smaller trees. But through time, through all these human practices and land use legacies, we've seen a real densification of the forest, particularly in that size class of smaller trees, these smaller shade-tolerant tree species that have grown up in the understory in the intervening years. And one of the consequences of these changes in forest structure is that we've seen an ingrowth, again, of these mid-sized trees or smaller shade-tolerant tree species that can act as fuel ladders. And the effect of fuel ladders is basically that it would take what would normally be a surface fire, a lower severity surface fire, and cross through the ladder fuel the mid-story into the canopy, which can create larger mortality events. This stands in contrast to what is generally believed to be the historical structure of these forests, which was maintained by more of an active, frequent fire disturbance regime, where fires would come through, burn the surface fuels, and retain the larger trees. The consequences of some of these changes, as well as changes in climate over the past century have resulted in increases in the frequency of large fire events, as well as the increases in the proportion of fires that burn at high severity. So that's what we're seeing here in these two figures. And so the question becomes, okay, so the forest structure is changing, the disturbance regime is changing. What do we do about it? And so the idea, which has been proposed by many, is to attempt to restore the Sierra Nevada forest ecosystems from these highly departed structure and function of forests and disturbance regimes by using some sort of intervention, like fuel treatments that reduce some of the density of these smaller trees that create the larger disturbance events, as well as exacerbate drought. The ultimate goal, by using some of these commercial thinning or mechanical treatments or mastication, prescribed fire, is that we would see some semblance of a restored forest, both in structure, function, and in disturbance regime. Now, I heard somebody recently say that this all sounds great. It sounds like grandmothers and apple pie. Like who can't get on board with that? It sounds wonderful. And I think in a lot of ways it does, but we have to think about potential collateral impacts of such restoration treatments. Because in one sense, these treatments are essentially simplifying the forest structure. And forest simplification may have these collateral negative impacts on old forest species, which are associated with more of a complex forest structure, with dense canopies and large, associated with dense canopy and large trees as well. And many of these species, of course, are declining, like the spotted owl. And the idea is that these treatments essentially go from in the regions or the areas of the forest where we have these old forest species. Treating those areas may reduce the complex vertical structure into a more simplified structure, and the closed canopy into a more open canopy. And so the hypothesis is then, these treatments may exacerbate some of the ongoing declines that we've seen in these old forest species over the past several decades. Whereas, if we don't treat a stand or a forest that's used by old forest species, perhaps these populations may continue to decline, but not as sharply as if we treated those stands. But the key question or the key issue here is that by not treating the forest, are we leaving these species more vulnerable to these novel disturbance events like large, severe fires, which may result in catastrophic habitat loss? And on the flip side of the coin, by treating these forests, even though we may see some short-term negative impacts of the treatments themselves, could these treatments in fact buffer the populations of old forest species against disturbance? And this is a very complicated question. It's not as simple as this cartoon might make you believe, but this really is a key sticking point in the implementation of fuel treatments at broader spatial scales. And so this leads us to the question, could forest restoration actually benefit old forest species? And I think that's, again, a complicated question. But there are several conditions under which I think this restoration could benefit old forest species. The first is that if restoration actually restores historical disturbance regimes to which these old forest species are adapted, then it would seem as though that could benefit them, right? Because these species evolved to survive and thrive in those disturbance regimes. The second is, as long as restoration itself doesn't remove those key habitat features associated with viability in these species, then maybe it could benefit them by reducing some of these larger, more novel disturbance events. And then finally, as long as the cost does not outweigh the benefit of restoration activities, which is, again, a complicated question, but in theory, if the benefits are greater than the cost, then we might have ourselves something that we can live with. For example, are there certain areas of the landscape, like these little pink polygons here, where we shouldn't treat because those surround really sensitive nesting areas or the like? And so, as you probably have guessed, I'm focusing on spotted owls, which again are kind of a model old forest species because we have really good data on them. So what do we know right now about spotted owls? What's kind of the current state of knowledge, their biology, their relationship with fire, and then the impact of restoration? So first of all, spotted owls have been long known to be associated with larger trees, dense canopy, and this complex understory vertical structure in forests. We know that across most of their range, they've been declining, particularly on national forest land. And although we have some pretty good ideas, some hypotheses regarding why they might be declining, the precise causes are uncertain, and there's certainly research that remains to be done. Spotted owls, as we know, are adapted to frequent low and or mixed severity fire regimes. There's a good amount of literature that supports this. But when it comes to the more novel disturbance regimes, larger, more severe fire events, we really, we're still learning about the role of those types of disturbances. And then finally, the effects of forest restoration treatments are not entirely known. So this does leave a lot of gaps in our knowledge. We come to the table with some really good tidbits and understanding of spotted owl ecology. I mean, the spotted owl is one of the most highly studied raptors in the world, after all, but there are some key knowledge gaps that remain to be filled before we can answer some of these important questions about forest restoration. And so, coming back to the question, could restoration benefit California spotted owls? I think we have a couple of questions that we can answer, we can seek to answer, given those knowledge gaps. The first is, are these novel disturbance regimes actually bad for spotted owls? If they are bad, then we have more of a reason to seek the restoration of those historical disturbance regimes. The second is, will owls actually be viable in these restored landscapes? We haven't implemented these types of restoration procedures at really broad scales, and so this question remains to be known. And then finally, can we find some sort of middle ground or optimum level of restoration that will achieve all the desired goals, both the forest ecosystem restoration goals and also the conservation of old forest species like the spotted owl? So how much restoration is enough to achieve those goals? And how much is too much, or how much is too little? And that's where the question of looking for this Goldilocks zone comes into play. We want to find something that's just right. And as it stands, if we shake our little magic 8-ball and look for the answer, I think that right now the answers to all these questions are a little hazy. But what I'm going to be talking about today is each of these questions and how some of my research as part of my PhD dissertation is going to inform these questions. So I'm going to start out by talking about this question: are novel disturbance regimes bad for spotted owls? So some of you, I'm sure, are familiar with a recent paper that came out in Frontiers in Ecology and the Environment that I led, which is part of my dissertation. If you're not, you can go check it out and find all the details on it, but I'm going to be presenting first on some of the results from that study, in which we looked at the effects of the 2014 King Fire on California spotted owls on one of our long-term study areas. So what I'm showing you here in the center, of course on the left is a California spotted owl, but in the center is our El Dorado density study area, which is outlined in those black dashes. And the black dots are our long-term spotted owl territories that we've surveyed for over 2 decades. And this is one of the 4 long-term demography study areas in the Sierra Nevada. And the big colored outline there, if you haven't guessed already, is the 2014 King Fire, where the darker, or rather the red color is showing forests that were burned at high severity, and as we kind of move to the green, we're looking at lower severity burn. So red is really highly intense forest fire. The King Fire was unusual by all accounts. It was above the 95th percentile for both total fire size and the area that burned at high severity for the state of California in the last 3 decades. And the King Fire, actually first I'm going to just give you a little bit of a picture of what that looks like deep in that big red patch. So in some of our spotted owl territories, this is the type of view that we would get when we visited those sites in the middle of the King Fire in the Rubicon Canyon. So although the King Fire was, by many accounts, devastating, it killed off trees at a pretty broad scale. It did actually provide us with a near perfect natural experiment to look at the effects of severe fire on spotted owls. I'm not sure we could have asked for a better experimental design, because the King Fire burned about half of our long-term study area, and most of that burned at high severity. We also had over 2 decades of pre-fire data, which allowed us to draw pretty strong inferences about the effect of fire in that year post-fire. I'll also say that we did pretty exhaustive survey coverage of this King Fire area, so we feel pretty confident that we didn't miss anything. And also we were able to complete all of our surveys for this project in 2015, the year following the King Fire, prior to the initiation of any proposed salvage operations on public lands. There were some salvage operations that occurred on private lands in that time, but we did account for that. So basically what I'm going to be showing you here is the effect of severe fire on spotted owls, more or less free of any impact of post-fire management. So we did 2 kind of mini studies as part of this project. The first was this before-after control impact, or BACI design, where we had 23 years of presence and non-detection data on our study area. Our response variable was the probability of site extinction or colonization, and our predictive variable was the proportion of a spotted owl territory that burned at high severity. And we evaluated a set of models using the model selection criteria on AIC. We also did kind of an exploratory habitat selection analysis using our first year of GPS data from 9 birds surrounding the fire. We collected over 1,000 GPS locations from those 9 birds. And basically what we were doing is we wanted to look at whether owls were selecting or avoiding different types of burned forests. So forests that did not burn at all, forests that burned at lower severity, and then forests that burned at higher severity. So for our before-after control impact experiment, we found a pretty strong relationship between the probability of site extinction and the proportion of a spotted owl territory that burned at high severity. So this logistic-like curve you're seeing here is one of the strongest relationships you'll see in ecology. It's very clear relationship between the amount of high severity burn and extinction probability. So the more of a spotted owl territory that burned, the more likely it was to go extinct, especially once you get above about 50%. Looking at the probability of site occupancy before and after the fire, we see that sites that did not burn at all didn't change their occupancy rate before and after the fire. So those were the sites that were outside of the burned area completely. For sites that burned less than half at high severity, we didn't really see a change in occupancy either. There was actually a slight uptick in occupancy for those sites, and we know from our individually marked birds that some of the birds that colonized the sites outside the fire in the year following the King Fire were the birds that previously occupied the sites within the King Fire footprint. So we know that some of that slight uptick there that you're seeing in the middle graph is a result of movement of individual birds from within the severely burned area to outside of it. And then finally, if more than half of a territory burned at high severity, we saw a really strong decrease in site occupancy, which really represents the effect of this elevated extinction probability as a result of severe fire that you see in the graph on the far left. And then we also found, well, first let me just say that, as many of you know, our study, the population on our study area has declined over the past 2 or so decades. It's been a pretty steady decline, and that's been shown in other publications as well. But the King Fire itself exacerbated that long-term decline because it resulted in the single largest one-year decline in the relative change in occupancy, or rather, the relative change in occupancy following the King Fire was the largest that we saw over the study period. So let me be very clear: the King Fire did not cause this long-term decline, but it did exacerbate it. There are other factors that led to this long-term decline, and part of those, some of those factors, one of those factors I'm going to be talking about in a few minutes, but the King Fire did exacerbate this longer-term decline. For our foraging study, what I'm showing you here is the individual GPS locations from those 9 owls surrounding the fire and all those colored dots, and a couple of zoomed-in maps of some of those birds. What we found using a really simple selection ratio is that spotted owls tended to avoid really severely burned forest, whereas spotted owls used unburned and lower severity burned forests in proportion to their availability within their foraging areas. And I will say this effect of severe fire, where spotted owls are really avoiding severely burned areas, is largely driven by that really big severely burned patch. And you can just see, I mean, it's quite obvious just looking at that figure. There are nearly zero foraging locations in the big red patch. So that effect is really driven in part by that large severely burned patch. And some of the ongoing studies that we're doing with the second and third year of data, which are coming in now, I'd like to look at the effect of patch size and configuration and other more kind of spatially complex measures of fire and fire patchiness. So I think there's a lot more to be learned here.
Hey, Gavin, can I interrupt you for just a quick second? We had somebody just want a clarification on a definition.
Yes.
So when you use the word extinction, does extinction equal owl mortality, or does it mean non-use of habitat in the context of how you're using that word?
That's a great question. So I'll just flip up this little image here. In some cases, it could mean owl mortality. We did have at least one mortality, and we found this charred federal leg band very kind of fortunately. We just stumbled upon this following the fire. So we know that in at least one case, and likely in multiple cases, there were either direct or indirect mortality events as a result of the fire. And this particular bird was one of the most productive birds ever on our study area, averaging around like 3 young per year. I mean, really prolific breeder. So it was a big loss to our population. But just to clarify that question even more, extinction is defined in this case as the probability that a site was not occupied, or rather the probability that an occupied site became unoccupied over that period from before the King Fire to after the King Fire. So it's really non-use, or maybe more precisely, it's non-territoriality. Although we in those sites that didn't go extinct, we also did not detect any birds either. So hopefully that clarifies the question. So what we can conclude from this little study, or not a little study, it's a big study, but what we can conclude from this study is that large severe fires, at least if they're like the King Fire, can negatively impact California spotted owls. And I was mentioning this earlier, but I want to be very clear that severe fire is a part of any fire regime. even a fire regime that is characterized generally by lower severity fires, there's always going to be some severe fire component. And I think the role of severe fire and its effect on spotted owls in particular is really mediated by patch size and configuration of severe fire. In the case of the king fire, severe fire mostly occurred in a really big, really continuous, ubiquitous, uniform patch of severe fire. So the effect that we saw in this case is really driven by the characteristics of this particular fire. Furthermore, our study supports the hypothesis that old forest species like the spotted owl are adapted to low and mixed severity fire. So remember, when territories burned less than half at high severity, there's a little more of a mix of severities within those territories. There was no change in occupancy, and that's generally supported across the literature as well. We did only use 1 year of post-fire data in this analysis, which is, a point of criticism by some people. But I will say that when we have a severely burned forest that looks like that on the left, in the photo on the left, it's going to take many decades, if not hundreds of years, for that forest to become what we know to be quality spotted owl nesting habitat that can be actively defended and used by owls in a territorial sense. And also, we know it's not entirely uncommon for large novel disturbance events like this to tip the scales and really drive an ecosystem shift. So it's possible that this landscape won't even be forest in many decades. It's hard to predict some of those changes. But I think it's clear that, at least in that really big, really severely burned patch, this represents an enduring loss of nesting habitat that's unlikely to regenerate anytime soon. In addition to some other stressors like drought and insect mortality, invasive species like the barred owl invasion, what we can see from this study is that megafires, these really large, really severe fires that are predicted to become more common, represent an additional mechanism that might threaten old forest species like the spotted owl. So back to this question, are novel disturbance regimes bad for spotted owls? And I think, certainly there are still questions that remain, but signs are pointing to yes. At the very least, if it's a fire that looks like the king fire, it's most certainly detrimental. So moving on to the second kind of condition of restoration. Restoration could probably benefit owls if these key habitat features are retained. So the question is, are owl populations actually going to be viable in restored landscapes? And that's a really difficult question because we don't have a lot of restored landscapes with which to compare. As this picture here that I'm showing you demonstrates, humans have really left their mark, and we've been leaving a legacy of human land use in the Sierra Nevada over the past century and more. But particularly in the last century, some major changes, particularly the selective removal of large old trees, has changed the way that the landscape looks. And so, maybe one way that we could learn whether owls and other old forest species might be viable in restored landscapes is by using reference landscapes, or landscapes that represent that represent the structure and the function that we desire to result from forest restoration. And so in this section, we're going to be looking at a comparison between national parks, so Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks in the Southern Sierra, with national forests, where we're using national parks as kind of this contemporary reference landscape, or a landscape that more or less has this intact disturbance regime that's desired in other areas of the Sierra, and more or less a limited logging history, at least compared to some of the other areas in the Sierra. And this approach that we're using is called the population comparisons approach. I don't know if you can see my clicker when I move it around, but the population comparisons approach essentially is a way to diagnose causes of population decline. There are many ways to do this, but the population comparisons approach is one that we have the right data to employ, where we compare populations of the same species in different landscapes that have different environmental features to see what we can learn about what may be driving different trends. in populations. So in this section, we're using 4 study areas, as I mentioned, 3 national forests. There's the Lassen, the El Dorado, and the Sierra National Forests. And then 1, or I guess it's actually 2 national parks, but it's 1 study area, the Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks. In the study, we're using 19 years of occupancy data. And the covariate that we're going to be looking at, or the environmental feature that we're going to be looking at, is tree size and canopy cover data within spotted owl territories at those different on those different study areas. And the data that we're using for this study is from Oregon State University. It's a really great landscape and ecosystem modeling group out there. It produces this. It's produced this product called GNN, Gradient Nearest Neighbor. It's an approach of interpolating landscape features or forest structure across a broader landscape. So what we did is we linked these covariates, tree size and canopy cover data, to local extinction rates, and saw how that may have influenced occupancy trends over the study period, which I didn't put the study period on here, but it's 1993 to 2011. And we evaluated a suite of models that contain different combinations of tree size and canopy cover, and their effect on extinction probability for spotted owl sites. Again, local extinction probability, by that I mean the probability that a site goes extinct or becomes unoccupied between 1 year and the next. And what we found, interestingly, fascinatingly actually, is that we found that across all 4 study areas, which were analyzed separately, the strongest predictor of extinction probability was the proportion of a spotted owl territory that contained large trees, so that's greater than 24 inches, and high canopy cover, which is greater than 70%. But not just those 2 features independently, but rather the co-occurrence of those 2 features. And that's what this little upside down U here is. It's the intersection of large trees and high canopy cover. So those 2 features, those 2 structural features, when they occur together, that really well predicted spotted owl site extinction rates. So what I'm showing you here is the 4 study areas denoted by these different colors here. And on the y-axis is the probability of site extinction. On the x-axis is the proportion of a spotted owl site or territory that contains large trees with high canopy, dense canopy. What we found on the 3 national forests is strikingly similar relationship between large trees and dense canopy with extinction probability, where when we had more of that habitat type, we saw a pretty sharp decline in extinction rates. And we saw really the exact same relationship on the national parks at Sequoia Kings Canyon. So this is really a really cool finding. I mean, all 4 of these study areas we analyzed separately, yet there's this emergent relationship that was that transcended the idiosyncrasies of place and applied to all 4 of these study areas. So really strong, probably evolutionary or adaptation that we're seeing here. So now what I'm showing you is the distribution of that habitat type. And before I jump into this, I have a lot of information on this slide, so just bear with me as I move through this. But what I'm showing you here is the distribution of this habitat type, the proportion of large trees and dense canopy, on the 3 national forests, where you see the average for, this is actually the median amount. The median amount of this habitat type in a spotted owl territory is about 5% of a territory area, okay? And it's pretty similar across the three national forests. Whereas when we look down here on the national park in Sequoia Kings Canyon, the median amount of this habitat type was around 20% of a spotted owl territory. So really a lot more of large trees and dense canopy within spotted owl sites. This is not across the broader landscape. This is within spotted owl sites. So this is really fascinating. And as we know, the populations of spotted owls are declining or have been declining on national forests over the past 2 decades. And that's what I'm showing you here. The top part of this graph that has the solid dots and those lines shows declines in occupancy over the 20-year period. And that corresponds with the y-axis on the left. And on the bottom part of that graph is the change in large trees and dense canopy, that habitat type, over the study period. You can see that it's pretty stable actually over the study period. There wasn't a major change in the distribution of that habitat type over the study period. Pretty stable. And as we see on the Sequoia Kings Canyon National Parks, the population is actually stable. Statistically, it was a stable population. It wasn't increasing, although it does look like it's increasing here. Again, the distribution of this habitat type is relatively stable. So what we see here is something really interesting. And that's that potentially these declines on national forests are a legacy of large trees that were lost, prior to the initiation of these studies, when potentially a greater proportion of a spotted owl site contained these features. So those legacy effects may have contributed to contemporary declines, although there weren't major changes in that habitat type over the study period. The other interesting insight is that what we may have demonstrated here is this multi-generational lag effect of logging, or of large tree loss that endured even after protections were enacted. As many of us know, forest management changed dramatically after 1992 when some regulations proposed by the CASPO report were enacted and taken up on federal land. So protections were enacted, but we still have these declines that may be this legacy effect of historical logging. So, of course, the Sequoia Kings Canyon National Park is not a restored landscape. We didn't restore it. It simply is a reference landscape. There was less of an impact of humans in that landscape over time, but I think that there's a lot to be learned from that landscape, and it can offer some guideposts for ecosystem restoration. So in other words, if our restored landscapes can resemble structurally, the type of landscape that we see in national parks, we may have a shot of supporting viable owl populations in those restored landscapes. So this question again, are owl populations viable in restored landscapes? There are certainly questions that remain, but as I see it, yes, they could be viable in those landscapes as long as those key habitat features are retained and promoted. Now, of course, it's not just that simple, because there are costs and benefits of restoration. Those same features that are beneficial to owls could make forests more flammable. So where's this Goldilocks zone? Where's the right amount of restoration that can minimize the effects of this novel disturbance regimes, but also maximize spotted owl persistence? So how much restoration is enough to achieve our goals? So this next section is really kind of the confluence of the last two sections. We're going to be bringing together what we learned in the first part, the effect of novel disturbance regimes on spotted owls, with what we know to be high quality habitat for owls and potentially habitat features that can promote viability. We're going to bring those together to try and figure out how we can optimize restoration outcomes. And this project that I'm going to describe here is most certainly not complete. And what I'm going to be showing you is really kind of the scaffolding where we're going to build from here, and maybe some hypothesized outcomes or potential results that we might see, some of the questions that we could answer with this approach that I'm going to describe. So I'll jump into. And I should also say this is a project that's in collaboration with Leroy Westerling and his postdoc Elisa Kaiser at UC Merced. So the question is, could fuels treatments actually promote old forest species conservation? Again, I think we can all agree that's a very complicated question. It's not simple, and we certainly don't presume to make it a simple question. But I think we can begin to explore the answers using this diagram here, which is basically a cost benefit analysis of restoration. So what I'm showing you on the y-axis is the probability of owl persistence in the long term, okay? So as you move up on this y-axis, we have a greater probability that owls will persist in the long term, or, you know, other old forest species. On the x-axis is the percentage of the landscape that we treat or attempt to restore through a variety of approaches, you know, mechanical thinning, mastication, and, you know, in a lot of cases, maybe preferably prescribed fire, because we know that's an important process on the landscape. But anyhow, you know, as we move to the right on this axis, we have a greater percentage of the landscape treated. Okay, so on the left half of this graph, or the left third, if we don't treat enough of the landscape, it's possible that the impacts of this novel disturbance regime may be rather high. We may have you know, destruction of owl habitat or habitat loss resulting from these really large, severe fires, et cetera, and that may depress the probability of owl persistence. But on the other hand, if we treat too much of the landscape and remove, you know, too many of those important features for owls and other old forest species, then we may also see a depressed persistence. So, you know, we don't really want to get too hot or too cold. We want to find some sort of middle ground, some optimum where we can maximize the spotted owl population persistence while considering both fire impacts and treatment impacts. So this is really the holy grail. We'd love to be able to produce you know, some sort of number or estimate of where we can land in terms of treatment that would maximize owl persistence. Now, there are a lot of approaches that one could use to answer this question, and the one that we've chosen is using spatially explicit population models. And these models are useful because they can really provide a quantitative, defensible approach to answering these types of questions, you know, scenarios of management using population viability analysis. So what I'm going to jump into now is a description of the models that we'll be using to answer this question about optimizing restoration outcomes. So the first model is a spatial occupancy model. And this model is going to be Sierra Nevada wide. And the occupancy model will be based on the existing protected activity center network that's distributed throughout the Sierra Nevada. And each one of those packs or protected activity centers will sort of be a node or a patch in a meta population model, more or less. And this model, in its simplest form, can allow us to simulate the dynamics of site occupancy through time. And this model is going to be a function of two main things. The first is, well, the model is spatially explicit, which means that the connectivity between sites matters. So the probability of a given site being occupied or being colonized or going extinct in a given year is going to be a function of how far that site is from other occupied sites. So it's a really spatially explicit approach. And then the other component of the model is what we learned in the second section that I just described, looking at habitat quality and how that informs occupancy dynamics and viability. So this model is great. It could exist on its own and run on its own, and we could sort of take that and run with it. But what we want to do is bring in a really realistic, at least as realistic as we can, model of fire to try and understand how fire may actually occur in the Sierra Nevada in the future. And what we're going to be doing is partnering with Leroy Westerling and his postdoc Elisa Kaiser at UC Merced. I'm calling this the Westerling-Kaiser fire model. I don't think that's actually anybody's ever called it that before, but just for simplicity, I'm calling it that right now. This model is really neat in that they've come up with a probabilistic model. It's all based on empirical data of fire occurrence and size and severity in the Sierra Nevada. And this model allows them to predict fire dynamics, occurrence of fire, the size of fire, and the severity of fire in the Sierra Nevada and into the future under climate change scenarios. So this model is a function of climate, it's a function of topography, and it's also a function of fuels. And so these two models can operate independently, but we are going to link them. And more specifically, we're going to link the output from Westerling-Kaiser fire model to our territory occupancy model, or our owl spatial occupancy model, where we're going to take the rules, the ecological relationships that we learned in this first section about the role of novel disturbance, and apply it to this occupancy model based on the outcomes of the fire model. So, for example, if a really catastrophic fire occurs, we have a really large area that burned at high severity, and that severely burned area overlapped with several owl territories, we can apply that rule where those sites will become extinct based on what we learned, the empirical relationships that we derived in the first section of this talk. And we're also going to link the models through fuels. So again, we know that fuel treatments may simplify the forests to a certain extent and have a collateral impact on spotted owls, on habitat quality in particular. So we're going to employ some rule sets there as well between fuels and habitat quality, where if we reduce fuels within a territory, we may reduce habitat quality to a certain extent. We're still developing that relationship between fuels and habitat quality. And then, of course, the neat part is that we're going to be developing all of these different treatment scenarios, treating a certain proportion of the landscape, or treating all over the place, or excluding spotted owl territories, not treating within those territories. So this is really the scaffolding to our model that we're in the process of developing right now. So let me give you a couple of ideas about what the outcomes might look like. So let's envision a scenario in which we allow treatment to occur across the landscape, regardless of whether it's within a spotted owl territory or not. So any area that can be treated. We may see that under low warming, so under kind of moderate climate change, that persistence maximizes maybe around, I'm just throwing out a number here, maybe 30% of the landscape, treat 30% of the landscape, and that's the maximum persistence for owls. Whereas if we have a higher warming scenario, we may see that the effects of climate on severe fire may be such that treating a larger percentage of the landscape would give us a greater benefit or greater persistence for owls. Now let's envision a scenario in which we exclude treatment from owl territories. We could see that persistence is actually higher under that scenario because we're not removing some of those key features. Maybe we can treat a little bit more of the landscape because we're not treating within owl territories. And under a higher warming scenario, it may be beneficial to treat a larger proportion of the landscape again. Now, we could make a really bold assumption, which I'm not entirely sure I feel comfortable making, but we could make a number of assumptions, one being that, well, treatment doesn't have any effect on owls. And if we made that sort of assumption, we could see that treating a much larger percentage of the landscape would maximize persistence. Again, these are all hypothetical, and we haven't run these models yet, but just giving you an idea about the types of questions that we could answer. There are a lot of caveats, of course, with any modeling approach. There are caveats, and this one is no different. The fire model is a little bit of a coarse spatial resolution, about 4-kilometer grid cells. It only allows these kind of landscape level assessments. And inference regarding habitat quality for spotted owls is really limited to those two variables that I described earlier, big tree density and canopy cover. Our inferences are really limited to disturbance, or rather our inferences regarding disturbances are limited only to severe fire, so we're not including drought-induced mortality and things of that nature. We are, of course, including climate change, which is pretty cool. But there are also no vegetation growth or fire feedbacks, or fire vegetation feedbacks in our model. But in order to kind of combat some of those issues, we're probably going to only do modeling over a 40 or so year period to try and limit the effects of vegetation growth or things of that nature. We hope that the benefits of this project would outweigh the caveats, and we think that they do. The first is that, of course, this would provide a quantitative assessment of risk for California spotted owls, as opposed to expert opinion and rules of thumb. Of course, this modeling approach makes the assumptions explicit. It's always good to know what's going in and coming out of your model. And the key model components are informed by really good science and data. We have really extensive data on spotted owls. which is really going to help for parameterizing this model. We're considering climate change in these projections. And also, this approach really builds a foundation for finer scale and mechanistic assessments. So going back to this question, how much restoration is enough? Right now, we don't know. We can't predict right now, but we're moving towards an answer. So to close, I want to say just one comment in particular, and that's that some people may view old forest species like the spotted owl, the Pacific fisher, the marten, and others as really impediments to the implementation of these broad-scale restoration field treatments. But I would push back on that a little bit and say, rather than an impediment, I think that these species can really act as a barometer of success. If we've done well in restoring these forests, spotted owls and fishers and martens and goshawks and pileated woodpeckers are going to be there in the forest. The really dangerous question or issue is that we don't want to screw it up. We want to be really careful before we make those decisions. We don't want to find out too late. So that's why we're being very cautious as we move forward in thinking about how to answer these really key questions regarding the role of restoration on spotted owls and other old forest species. So with that, I'd like to just say thank you again for joining me today, and I'd like to thank all of the state and federal agencies and institutions that have funded this research over the years. And with that, I think we have a few minutes. I may be able to answer a question or two or three, perhaps.
Hey, Gavin. So we have some questions in the Q&A pod. So if you want, I'm happy to read them, or I can just ask you to open it up and you can read them however you want. So okay. The first one comes from John Bailey, and I'll just read this one out loud. Does treatment and restoration always mean simplification in your model? Some treatments can actually enhance structural complexity.
That's a really good question, John. I think that modeling approaches can get really complex, and certainly we could think about how treatment may affect forest structure in different ways, and that's when I showed those three different graphs showing the different curves, one assumption we could make about treatments is that in fact they don't simplify the forest, but they do enhance structural complexity and benefit old forest species in the sense that they enhance the features that they're associated with. I do think that one of the main concerns broadly that people have about restoration is that it does simplify the forest structure, and so we want to make sure we account for that concern as we think about modeling the viability of spotted owls. But that's a really good question, something that we'll consider. I appreciate the question. The second question here, is it okay, Megan, if I read this out loud as well?
Yes, sorry, I was muted. I didn't know that. Go for it.
Okay. So the second question is, please clarify your sentence that CASPO, or California spotted owls, are primarily declining on national forests. Is that a function? Oop, I lost the question. Is that a function that most CASPO occur on national forests, or are you stating that CASPO population on non-federal lands are doing better? That's a great question. I think what I meant by that sentence is that CASPO on non-federal lands are doing better. In terms of the distribution of CASPO, there being more or less on national forests or national parks, that's a question that I didn't address here. So you can mark that as answered, I think.
Okay.
And again, I just want to say, I certainly would like to answer as many questions as I can. Feel free to email me if your question doesn't get answered or you'd like to ask it later. The next question is, with the loss of Sierran large diameter pines due to bark beetle drought effects, will this have a similar effect as wildfire, or will it be better because there will be a good portion of understory plants and trees remaining? Great question, Gail. That's bringing in the role of insect-related mortality and drought. bringing in those effects is something that I would really like to do. And I think that our modeling framework, the PVA, the population viability analysis framework that I introduced in this third section of the talk, I think it lays a foundation for answering some of those questions in a quantitative sense, but we can't do that at this point. We're going to start simple, start with fire, and maybe move to bring in some of these more complex features, or rather disturbances later that we know less about. We just don't know quite as much about the role of bark beetle and drought impacts on spotted owls. Next question is the comparison of the parks versus Forest Service populations published or otherwise available. I actually meant to mention that when I got to that section, and it's not published yet. It's actually currently in review for publication. So for everybody that is still on the call, which it looks like most everybody who is listening is still on the call, it's not currently available. And if you would like to share that knowledge, you can feel free, but I would definitely ask that you would contact me prior to sharing that knowledge in any form. I sort of trust that the people on this call are interested in research, and I think that disseminating research results even prior to publication is good for science. So I'm doing that here kind of as a courtesy to the research community. But I would ask that if you do share that information, that you ask me first. It's not currently available, though. I'll definitely, if this anonymous viewer would like for me to notify them when it's available, they can email me, and I'll do that. Another question by Anonymous. When you're working with the modeling project, would you be able to give actual management recommendations on where managers should treat on their own forests? Or will management implications beyond just the % of the landscape that should be treated? So basically this is, are the recommendations spatially explicit or are they spatially implicit? Can we give you spatial management recommendations? I think that at this point, the most specific recommendations that we'll be able to give you is something around the % of an area that can be treated. There is a whole host of really good research papers that have investigated the, kind of the optimal placement of these treatments, based on topography. And I encourage whoever this viewer is to check those out. Although I'm sure they're familiar with some of these papers. But at this point, we're probably limited to more general recommendations than specific. You need to place the treatment on this type of slope or in these elevations or whatnot. So that's definitely something that we want to move towards, and that's what I said in the anticipated benefits slide. Is that this kind of acts as a launching pad for answering some really neat questions beyond what we're trying to answer at this point. So the final question here looks like, what did you consider low severity and high severity in terms of % mortality, basal area loss? Great question, Carla. High severity fire was defined as 75% canopy mortality or above. I will say that most, if not all, of those areas that burned at high severity, especially in that large patch, burned at 100% mortality. So, we use kind of these even breaks, 25% breaks, but the high severity, for the most part, represents 100% mortality. When do you expect this third piece, the cost benefits model, to be available to the scientific community? Would you consider a follow-up webinar to present results to the community before publication? Absolutely, Katie. I would love to do that. And I can say that we're shooting for midsummer to have that piece completed. So sometime, you know how these things go. Sometimes you can run into some roadblocks that may delay the product, but we're really shooting for June, and I think that's possible. So, so Katie, I do recognize your name. I'll make sure to get in touch with you about that when we have more information. David Hamilton, will modeling take into account pre-treatment of pack acres? I guess I'm not entirely sure what David means by that question. David, do you mean treatment that occurred prior to the modeling period, or I think you might be able to just type in your question or your answer to my follow-up question.
While he's doing that, there's a question that showed up in the chat pod from Becky. Okay, such as buffered areas.
Oh, such as buffered areas, raking around a legacy tree. I think that's the type of like really fine scale stuff like that is probably beyond the capabilities of the model at this point, or at least my understanding of your question. So yeah, I'm not entirely sure that's a question we could answer at this point.
There's one more.
Your question?
Yeah, there's one more in the in the chat pod. So I'll just read it. If you open that, it might be better. But Becky Miller asks, are you modeling multiple restoration scenarios? Prescriptions can be homogeneous, but can also incorporate patchiness and varying levels of basal area retained. Are you working with managers to understand the prescriptions proposed throughout the Sierra Nevada?
I need to pull up that question because it's
it's in the chat pod. So, and a couple of questions up.
Let me see if I can figure that out.
Yeah.
If I can find the
down
chat.
at the bottom is the chat window. So scroll down. No, you're good. So we're still seeing your screen. So I can.
Okay.
Maybe.
Active. I was gonna say, if you want to stop sharing your screen, Gavin, it'll be a little easier to get to.
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah. I see it now. Okay. Oh, actually, I don't.
So it's down at the bottom. Either your toolbar moved down at the bottom. You should have a chat.
Oh, chat window. Okay, I see it now. Okay, I'm sorry about that. I swear I'm not a technological dinosaur.
Mm-hmm.
So let's see. Are you modeling multiple restoration scenarios? Prescription can be homogeneous, but can also incorporate patchiness and varying levels of basal area retained. Are you working with managers to understand the prescriptions proposed throughout the Sierra Nevada? I'd say, well, first of all, we're going to model multiple restoration scenarios in the sense that we're going to be modeling, different extents of treatment, in terms of, less or more, like relative, amounts of treatment. In terms of these really fine scale questions, again, I think that at least the capabilities of our model at this point may not be able to address really fine scale differences in the outcomes of treatment, like varying levels of basal area. Although, there may be ways to link that to our basal area model for site extinction in the owl population model. Becky, if you'd like to follow up with me on that question, I'd actually be interested to discuss that a little more with you. We're certainly getting feedback from people who are in the land management business. So this would be a good question to ask them. I appreciate the question.
Awesome. I think we tackled all the questions. I think there's some people that have questions about CEUs. So if you entered your CEU information on the registration page, you don't need to do anything to get CEUs. If you did not enter CEU information on the registration page, you need to email me. And if you open up the chat pod, you'll see my email address in there. I'd like to thank Gavin so much for taking the time out to present this awesome, informative webinar today. And there's a lot of helpful links in the chat pod. So if you want to follow up with Gavin, send him an email, ask him any follow-up questions, feel free to do that. There's also a link to the Qualtrics survey that will help me do a better job in my profession. So if you have a minute to take that survey, that would be really useful. So please mark your calendar for February 21st. That's our next webinar. And we'll be talking about some folks in the Forest Service that are using pheromones as a deterrent for beetle infestations. So thanks again, Gavin, and thanks, Mark, for your continued support.
Yep, you're welcome, and I'll put a plug in for eextension.org again for if you're a member or a basic or premium eExtension member and like the way these webinars are ran, feel free to contact me. I put a link in chat there, and my contact information is on that. And if you're not a member, institution and would like to know more, contact me and we can talk more about that.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
All right, thanks, folks.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.